The mountain air cut through flesh like a skinned blade. And Magnus Harlow had never been the kind of man to ignore suffering when it stood right in front of him. He emerged from the general store with supplies tucked under one massive arm, his breath misting in the frigid November air of 1878. When he saw her, a young woman huddled against the weathered planks outside the Red Canyon Tavern, her thin shawl doing nothing against the bitter cold that had descended on Concordia, Kansas, like a wolf on wounded prey. Her lips had gone the color of twilight, her whole body trembling so violently he could see it from 20 paces away, and something in his chest tightened at the sight. Magnus was not a town man by nature. He spent most of his days in the mountains west of here, trapping and hunting, his body hardened by the wilderness into something more stone than flesh. His shoulders were broad enough to fill a doorway, his arms thick with muscle earned through years of splitting wood, hauling game, and surviving in places that would kill softer men. Dark hair fell past his collar, streaked with early traces of silver, though he had only seen 30 winters. His face was all hard angles and weathered planes, with eyes the color of winter sky that missed very little. Most folks in town gave him a wide berth, uncertain what to make of a man who chose solitude over society, but Magnus had never much cared what others thought. He crossed the frozen mud of Main Street in 4 long strides, his boots crunching through ice. Up close, the woman looked even worse. She could not have been more than 22 or 23, with auburn hair that hung in damp tangles around a face that might have been pretty if it were not pinched with cold and hunger. Her dress was threadbare, patched in places, the kind of garment that spoke of hard times and harder choices. Her hands, clutched around herself, were red and chapped, the nails broken. "Miss," Magnus said, his voice rougher than he intended, "you cannot stay out here. You will freeze." Her eyes lifted to his, wide and dark as a doe's, filled with a mixture of fear and desperation. "I have nowhere else," she whispered, her teeth chattering so hard she could barely form the words. Magnus did not waste time with more questions. He shrugged out of his heavy bearskin coat and wrapped it around her thin shoulders before she could protest. The coat swallowed her whole, and he lifted her as easily as he might lift a child, carrying her toward the tavern door. She made a small sound of surprise, but was too cold to fight him. The interior of the Red Canyon was thick with pipe smoke and the smell of whiskey and unwashed bodies. A dozen pairs of eyes turned toward them as Magnus kicked the door shut behind him with his boot heel. The warmth hit them like a physical force, and the woman in his arms gasped at the sudden change. "Magnus Harlow," said Red Willie, the tavern keeper, a stout man with a face like weathered leather. "That is twice this week you have brought trouble through my door." "She needs the fire," Magnus said flatly, carrying his burden toward the massive stone hearth that dominated the far wall. Orange flames danced and crackled, throwing wild shadows across the rough-hewn walls. He set the woman down gently on the bench closest to the heat, then knelt before her to rub warmth back into her frozen hands. "I did not ask for help," she said weakly, but there was no real protest in her voice. "Did not need to ask," Magnus replied. His hands were huge and calloused, engulfing her small fingers completely as he worked feeling back into them. "What is your name?" "Ophelia," she said after a moment. "Ophelia Jensen. Where are you from, Ophelia Jensen? And why are you freezing outside a tavern instead of somewhere warm?" Her eyes filled with tears that she tried to blink away. "I came here 3 weeks ago. I was supposed to meet my cousin. She wrote that she had work for me. But when I arrived, I learned she died of fever last month. I have been trying to find work, but no one will hire me. I spent my last coins 2 days ago." Magnus felt anger kindle in his gut. Concordia was not a large town, perhaps 200 souls if you counted the surrounding farms. Someone should have helped this woman before now. Red Willie, he called over his shoulder. Bring food, stew if you have it, bread, coffee. That will cost you, Red Willie said. I know what things cost, Magnus said, his tone brooking no argument. He heard the tavern keeper shuffle away, muttering. Ophelia was shaking her head. I cannot pay you back, I have nothing. Did I ask for payment? Magnus stood, his full height making her crane her neck to look up at him. Stay by the fire, eat, we will figure out the rest after. He moved to the bar to settle accounts with Red Willie, very aware of the curious stares from the other patrons. Most were locals, farmers or shopkeepers taking refuge from the cold with a drink. But there were a few strangers, drifters passing through, and Magnus marked their faces out of habit. A man survived in wild country by paying attention. Red Willie set a bowl of venison stew, a chunk of dark bread, and a tin cup of steaming coffee on a tray. That girl is trouble, he said quietly. Been hanging around for days. Some folks are saying she is a thief or worse. Some folks say a lot of things, Magnus replied, dropping coins on the scarred wood of the bar. Most of it is nonsense. He carried the tray back to Ophelia, who looked at the food as though it might disappear if she blinked. Eat slowly, he cautioned. Your stomach will not thank you if you rush it. She nodded, taking the spoon with trembling hands. The first bite seemed to undo something in her, and tears spilled down her cheeks as she ate. Magnus looked away, giving her what privacy he could. He understood pride and what it cost to accept help. He stood with his back to the fire, arms crossed, his presence a wall between her and the rest of the room. You are Magnus Harlow, Ophelia said after she had eaten half the bowl. Her voice was stronger now, steadier. I have heard people speak of you. They say you live in the mountains like a hermit, that you can track anything and survive anywhere. People talk too much, Magnus said. They also say you are dangerous. He glanced down at her, one eyebrow raised. Do I frighten you? She considered this seriously, studying his face with those dark eyes. No, she said finally. You brought me inside. You gave me your coat and your fire. A dangerous man would not have done that. A dangerous man might do exactly that, Magnus said, if he wanted something. Do you want something from me? The question was direct, her gaze steady despite the vulnerability of her position. Magnus shook his head. Only that you do not freeze to death in front of a tavern. Finish your food. She did, scraping the bowl clean and eating every crumb of bread. The coffee she drank slowly, savoring the warmth. Color was returning to her face, and Magnus could see now that she was indeed pretty, with fine features and intelligent eyes. She had the look of someone educated, which made her situation all the more puzzling. Where were you before you came here? He asked. St. Louis, Ophelia said. I worked as a teacher in a small school, but the school closed when funding ran out. My father died 2 years ago and my mother passed last winter. I had no family left except my cousin here, or so I thought. You are educated then? Yes. I can read and write in English and French. I know arithmetic, history, geography, and literature, but that does not help much when no one will hire a woman on her own. There was bitterness in her voice, and Magnus could not blame her. The world was not kind to women without protection or means. Can you cook? So? Well enough. I kept house for my parents. Why? Magnus made a decision that would change both their lives, though he did not yet know it. I have a cabin in the mountains about a day's ride west of here. It is rough living, but it is warm and there is always food. I am heading back tomorrow. You can come with me if you want. Work for your keep until you figure out what comes next. Ophelia stared at him as though he had spoken in a foreign tongue. You are offering me work, just like that. You do not even know me. I know you are freezing and hungry and have nowhere else to go. I know you have not stolen or begged, which means you have pride and principles. That is enough." He paused. "But understand this, it will be hard work. The cabin needs a woman's hand. I am gone for days at a time checking trap lines. You would need to keep the home fire burning, cook, preserve food for winter, mend clothes. And you would be alone much of the time. Some people cannot handle that kind of solitude." "I am not afraid of being alone," Ophelia said quietly. "And I am not afraid of hard work." "But why would you do this for a stranger?" Magnus was quiet for a long moment, watching the flames dance in the hearth. "My mother was a widow when she met my father," he said finally. "She had nothing and no one. He gave her a chance when no one else would. Maybe I am just paying that forward." Ophelia's eyes softened. "Then yes, I will come with you and I will work hard, I promise." "We leave at dawn," Magnus said. "For tonight, Red Willie has rooms upstairs. I will pay for one." "I cannot ask you to. You are not asking. I am telling you." His tone was firm but not unkind. "Get some rest. Tomorrow will be a long ride." Magnus negotiated a room for Ophelia and paid for it over Red Willie's continued grumbling about charity cases. He stayed in the tavern until she had gone upstairs, his presence ensuring no one bothered her. Then he collected his supplies and headed to the livery stable where he kept his horse when in town, a sturdy buckskin gelding named Scout. The stable was dim and smelled of hay and horse. Magnus found an empty stall and laid out his bedroll, preferring the simple shelter to the cost and fuss of a hotel room. Scout nickered softly, and Magnus gave him a handful of oats before settling in for the night. Sleep came slowly. He kept thinking about the woman upstairs, about the trust she had placed in him by agreeing to come to his cabin. It was a risk for both of them. Magnus valued his solitude, his freedom. Having another person in his space would change things, but he could not have left her to freeze. It went against everything his father had taught him about what it meant to be a man. Dawn came cold and clear. Magnus was up with the first light, checking his supplies and saddling Scout. He led the horse to the tavern and found Ophelia waiting outside, wrapped in his bearskin coat, looking small and uncertain in the gray morning light. "You came," she said, and he heard relief in her voice. "Said I would." Magnus helped her mount, then swung up behind her. She fit against him easily, small enough that his arms went around her to hold the reins. He could feel her trembling, though whether from cold or nervousness he could not tell. They rode west out of Concordia as the sun broke over the horizon, painting the endless prairie in shades of gold and amber. The land here was vast and open, rolling grasslands that stretched to the edge of sight. In the distance, the smoky hills rose like shadows, and beyond them, the higher mountains where Magnus made his home. Ophelia was quiet for the first hour, but gradually she began to relax against him, her body adjusting to the rhythm of the horse. Magnus kept Scout to a steady pace, not pushing hard but making good time. The cold bit at their faces, but the sky remained clear. "Tell me about your cabin," Ophelia said as the sun climbed higher. "What is it like?" "Small," Magnus said. "One room with a sleeping loft. Stone fireplace, wood floor. I built it myself 5 years ago. There is a creek nearby that runs year-round, good hunting and trapping in every direction. The nearest neighbor is probably 10 miles away. That is very isolated. That is why I like it." He paused. "Will it bother you?" Being so far from other people, Ophelia was quiet for a moment. "I do not know," she admitted, "but I would rather be isolated and safe than surrounded by people who will not help. At least in your cabin I will have purpose." They stopped at midday to rest the horse and eat the provisions Magnus had packed. Dried meat, hard cheese, and water from his canteen. Ophelia ate gratefully, then walked a little to stretch her legs while Magnus checked Scout's hooves and tack. "How did you become a mountain man?" she asked when they were riding again. "My father was a trapper," Magnus said. "He taught me everything he knew. When he died, I kept doing what I knew how to do. I sell furs in town, trade for what I need, and spend the rest of my time in the mountains. It is a good life." "Do you never get lonely?" The question caught him off guard. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but lonely is better than surrounded by people who want something from you. That is a sad way to see the world. That is an honest way to see the world." There was no heat in his words, only matter-of-fact truth. They rode in companionable silence after that, watching the land change as they climbed into the hills. The prairie gave way to scrub oak and pine, the air growing sharper and cleaner. Deer scattered at their approach, and once Magnus spotted a coyote watching them from a rocky outcrop. The sun was sinking toward the horizon when they finally reached the cabin. It sat in a small clearing, backed against a steep hillside and fronted by a meadow through which a clear creek ran. The structure was solid, built of heavy logs with a stone chimney rising from one end. A small barn stood nearby, and Magnus could see his other horse, a gray mare named Ash, grazing in a makeshift corral. "Home," Magnus said simply, dismounting and helping Ophelia down. She stood looking at the cabin, her expression unreadable. Magnus felt suddenly anxious, seeing his home through her eyes. It was rough and plain, a far cry from what she must have known in St. Louis. "It is perfect," Ophelia said softly, and the tension eased from his shoulders. Magnus showed her inside. The cabin was cold but clean, everything in its place. The main room held a table and 2 chairs, a dry sink, shelves lined with supplies, and the large fireplace. A ladder led to the sleeping loft where Magnus kept his bedroll. There was a wooden trunk, a rifle mounted over the door, and not much else. "I will build up the fire," Magnus said. "You can have the loft. I will sleep down here." "This is your home," Ophelia protested. "I cannot take your bed. The loft is warmer, and you need the rest more than I do." "Do not argue." He was already moving, building a fire in the hearth with the practiced ease of long habit. The kindling caught quickly, flames spreading to the larger logs, and soon warmth began to fill the space. Ophelia explored the cabin while he worked, running her hands over the solid furniture, examining the supplies on the shelves. "You are well stocked," she observed. "Winter in the mountains is no joke. I learned early to be prepared." Magnus stood, dusting off his hands. "There is a root cellar outside with more supplies. Smoked meat, dried beans, flour, cornmeal, coffee, and sugar. We will not starve." "What do you need me to do?" Her question was direct, businesslike. Magnus appreciated that. "Tonight, nothing. Settle in. Tomorrow I will show you how everything works. Where the well is, how to bank the fire, what chores need doing. But first, you need real rest in a real bed." He climbed to the loft and came down with an armload of blankets and furs. "It gets cold at night, even with the fire. Use all of these." Ophelia took the blankets, her eyes meeting his. "Thank you, Magnus, for everything. I know I have said it before, but I mean it. You saved my life." "You would have found a way," Magnus said gruffly, uncomfortable with gratitude. "You have got survival in you, I can see it." That night, Magnus made a simple supper of fried salt pork, beans, and cornbread. They ate at the small table, and Magnus found himself watching Ophelia in the firelight. She had washed her face and hands, braided her hair back, and some of the exhaustion had left her features. She looked younger now, and there was a quiet strength in the way she held herself that Magnus admired. "Tell me about St. Louis," he said. "What was it like?" Ophelia smiled, a real smile that transformed her face. "Loud, crowded. The school where I taught was in a poor neighborhood, mostly immigrant children. Their parents worked in the factories or on the riverboats. The children were so eager to learn even when they came to class hungry or tired. I loved teaching them. Why did the school close? Her smile faded. Money, mostly. The man who funded it died and his children had no interest in continuing his charity. We tried to raise funds, but it was not enough. 40 children lost their chance at education. That is a hard thing. Yes, she was quiet for a moment, but maybe someday I will teach again. Maybe out here there are children who need a teacher. Maybe, Magnus agreed, though he doubted it. Children in this country learned from their parents practical skills for survival. Book learning was a luxury few could afford. They cleaned up together, falling into an easy rhythm despite their newness to each other. Magnus showed Ophelia where things were kept, how he preferred his kitchen organized. She listened carefully, asking questions, filing away information. When the fire was banked and everything was settled for the night, Magnus gestured to the loft. "Go on up. I will be down here if you need anything." Ophelia hesitated at the base of the ladder. "Magnus, you are a good man. I want you to know that I see that." Before he could respond, she climbed the ladder and disappeared into the loft. Magnus stood alone in the firelit cabin, her words echoing in his mind. He could not remember the last time someone had called him good. Most people called him strange or hermit or dangerous. But this woman with her dark eyes and quiet strength saw something different. Magnus made his bed near the fire, wrapping himself in his bedroll and a heavy bearskin. He could hear small sounds from above as Ophelia settled in, and for the first time in years, his cabin felt like something more than just shelter. The next weeks fell into a pattern. Magnus rose before dawn, built up the fire, and started coffee. Ophelia would come down from the loft, sleepy-eyed but willing, and they would eat breakfast together in the gray morning light. Then Magnus would show her some new aspect of life in the mountains, how to draw water from the well without breaking through the ice, how to split kindling, how to bake bread in the Dutch oven, how to render fat for soap and candles. Ophelia learned quickly. She had clever hands and a sharp mind, and she approached every task with determination. Within a week, she was managing the cabin on her own while Magnus checked his trap lines. He would leave at dawn and return at dusk to find the fire burning warm, food cooking, his clothes mended, or a new batch of candles made. But it was more than just the work. The cabin felt different with Ophelia in it. There was life in it now, warmth beyond what the fire provided. She sang sometimes while she worked, old songs Magnus half remembered from his childhood. She asked him questions about the mountains, about tracking and trapping, about the animals and plants. She was curious about everything, soaking up knowledge like parched earth soaking up rain. And Magnus found himself talking more than he had in years. He told her about his father, about learning to read sign and weather. He showed her how to identify animal tracks in the snow, how to tell which trees would burn hottest and longest. He taught her to shoot, standing behind her to steady her arms, surprised by how naturally she took to it. "You have a good eye," he said after she hit the target 3 times in a row. "My father taught me," Ophelia said. "He believed women should know how to protect themselves." "Your father was wise." One night, about 3 weeks after she had arrived, Ophelia came down from the loft and sat by the fire where Magnus was oiling his traps. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Go ahead. Why do you really live alone? It cannot just be that you prefer solitude." "There is more to it." Magnus was silent for a long moment, his hands stilling on the trap. "I was engaged once," he said finally. 8 years ago. Her name was Sarah. We were planning to marry, to build a life together, but her father did not approve of me, said I was too wild, too rough. He wanted her to marry a shopkeeper in town, someone respectable. Sarah was supposed to choose me anyway. She promised she would. But when it came down to it, she chose her father's approval over me. He set down the trap, staring into the fire. I decided then that I was better off alone. That depending on another person only led to pain. Ophelia reached out and placed her hand over his. Her palm was warm, her touch gentle. I am sorry that happened to you, but not everyone is like Sarah. Some people keep their promises. Magnus looked at her hand on his, so small against his weathered skin. Do you keep your promises, always, Ophelia said firmly. My word is all I have. I would never break it. Something shifted between them in that moment. A deepening of connection that went beyond employer and employee, beyond even friendship. Magnus turned his hand over, lacing his fingers through hers, and neither of them pulled away. December came with heavy snows that buried the meadow and turned the world into a white wilderness. Magnus could not check his distant trap lines, but he set snares closer to home and split wood while Ophelia made the cabin as cozy as any house in town. She sewed curtains from fabric Magnus had stored in the trunk, made braided rugs from scraps, and kept the coffee pot always warm on the hearth. They spent long evenings by the fire, talking about everything and nothing. Ophelia told him about the books she had read, the places she dreamed of seeing. Magnus told her about the mountains, about tracking a cougar through 3 days of snow, about finding a hidden valley full of elk. They played checkers with a set Magnus carved from wood, and Ophelia proved to be a cunning opponent. It was during one of these evenings that Magnus realized he was falling in love with her. The thought struck him with the force of a physical blow as he watched her laugh at something he had said, the firelight turning her hair to copper. She was beautiful, yes, but it was more than that. She was brave and strong and kind. She had taken a hard situation and made the best of it. She never complained, never asked for more than he could give. She had made his lonely cabin into a home. The realization terrified him. He had sworn he would never let himself be vulnerable again, never risk the pain of rejection. But here he was, more than halfway gone on a woman who probably saw him as nothing more than the mountain man who had saved her from freezing. Ophelia looked up and caught him staring. "What is it?" she asked. "Nothing," Magnus lied. "Just thinking." "About what?" "About how different things are now, with you here." Ophelia set down the sock she was darning. "Different good or different bad?" "Good," Magnus said without hesitation. "Very good." She smiled, and there was something in her eyes that made his heart hammer in his chest. "I am glad. Because I love it here, Magnus. I love the quiet and the mountains and the simple life. I love that I have purpose and work that matters. I have never felt so content." "You are not lonely?" he asked. "No regrets about leaving town behind?" "No regrets," she said softly. "Everything I need is right here." The way she looked at him when she said it made Magnus wonder if she meant more than just the cabin and the mountains. He wanted to ask, wanted to tell her what he was feeling, but the words stuck in his throat. What if he was wrong? What if she did not feel the same way? He could not bear to make her uncomfortable, to ruin what they had built, so he said nothing, and the moment passed. Christmas came quietly. Magnus had rarely celebrated the holiday in recent years, but Ophelia made it special. She baked a spice cake with their precious store of sugar and cinnamon, roasted a wild turkey Magnus had shot, and made decorations from pine boughs and red berries. On Christmas morning, she gave him a new shirt she had sewn in secret, and Magnus gave her a fur-lined cloak he had been working on late at night when she was asleep. "It is beautiful," Ophelia whispered, running her hands over the soft beaver fur. "Magnus, you did not have to do this." "I wanted to. You have made this winter better than any I have known. You deserve something nice." She threw her arms around his neck in an impulsive hug, and Magnus stood frozen for a heartbeat before his arms came up to hold her. She fit perfectly against him, her head tucked under his chin, and he breathed in the scent of her hair, wood smoke and pine, and something sweet that was just her. "Thank you," she said against his chest, "for everything. For saving me, for giving me a home, for treating me with kindness and respect. You are the best man I have ever known." Magnus held her tighter, his heart so full it ached. "Ophelia," she pulled back to look up at him, and whatever she saw in his face made her eyes widen. They stood there, inches apart, the air between them charged with possibility. Magnus could feel his pulse hammering in his throat. All he had to do was lean down, close the distance, and he would know if she felt the same way. But before he could move, a sound outside made him stiffen. Scout was whinnying in alarm, and Magnus heard the unmistakable sound of other horses in the clearing. "Stay here," he said, releasing Ophelia and moving to the rifle mounted over the door. He checked the load and stepped outside into the bright winter sunlight. 3 men sat on horseback in his meadow. Magnus did not recognize them, but he knew the type. Rough clothes, hard faces, guns worn low. Trouble. "Help you, gentlemen," Magnus called, his voice calm but his body coiled and ready. The leader, a man with a scarred face and mean eyes, looked him over. "Saw smoke from your chimney. Wondered if you had room to share your fire. Afraid not. I keep to myself up here." "That is not very neighborly," the man said. His companions spread out slightly, flanking him. "We have been riding for days in this cold. Could use some hot food and a warm place to sleep. There is a town called Concordia about a day's ride east. Plenty of hospitality there. See, the thing is, we are not really welcome in Concordia right now." The man's hand drifted toward his gun. "So we are going to accept your hospitality whether you offer it or not." Magnus raised the rifle, not quite pointing it at anyone but making his intentions clear. "You are welcome to try, but I promise you, at least one of you will not ride away from here." The 3 men exchanged glances. They were clearly weighing their chances. Magnus was one man with one rifle, but he had the advantage of position and cover. And there was something in his stance, in the cold certainty of his voice, that gave them pause. "You are making a mistake," the scarred man said. "The mistake would be starting something you cannot finish. Now ride on, find somewhere else to cause trouble." For a long moment no one moved. Then the scarred man spat in the snow and turned his horse. "Come on," he said to his companions. "This is not worth it." They rode off, disappearing into the trees, but Magnus stood watching long after they were gone. His instincts told him this was not over. Men like that did not give up easily, especially when they saw something they wanted. He went back inside to find Ophelia standing by the window, her face pale. Who were they? Drifters. Probably outlaws running from something. Magnus set the rifle down but did not put it back over the door. "They are gone for now, but they might come back. We need to be careful. Should we go to town? Tell the marshal." Magnus shook his head. "By the time we got there and back, they could have circled around and burned this place to the ground. No, we stay here and we stay alert. Can you handle the rifle if you need to?" "Yes." There was no hesitation in her voice. "Good, keep it close. And if anything happens, do not hesitate." Men like that are dangerous. Christmas Day passed under a shadow. Magnus spent the afternoon checking the perimeter, making sure the horses were secure, preparing for trouble. Ophelia stayed inside, the rifle across her lap, watching the tree line. Night fell with no sign of the strangers, but Magnus did not relax his guard. He sat by the fire cleaning his weapons, loading extra ammunition, making plans. Ophelia came down from the loft when she realized he was not going to sleep. "Let me keep watch," she said. "You need to rest." "I have gone longer without sleep. You should rest, Magnus. She sat down beside him, her hand on his arm. I know you want to protect me, but I am not helpless. Let me help you. He looked at her, this educated woman from St. Louis who had learned to shoot and split wood and survive in the wilderness. She was right. She was not helpless, and he could not protect her if exhaustion made him careless. All right, he said. We will take turns. 4 hours on, 4 hours off. Wake me if you see or hear anything unusual. They worked out a system. Magnus slept first, though it was not really sleep, more of a light doze with one part of his mind always listening. When Ophelia woke him for his watch, he could see the strain on her face. Keeping watch in the dark, knowing danger might be lurking, was hard on the nerves. Nothing, he asked. Nothing. Maybe they really did move on. Maybe. Magnus did not believe it, but there was no point worrying her more. The attack came 2 nights later in the hours before dawn when sleep is deepest. Magnus woke to the smell of smoke and was on his feet instantly, heart pounding. The barn was burning, flames already climbing the walls, and he could hear Scout and Ash screaming in terror. Ophelia, he shouted. Stay inside, keep the rifle. He grabbed a bucket and ran for the creek, knowing even as he did that it was probably too late to save the barn. The fire had been set deliberately, meant to draw him out, and as he reached the water he heard gunshots from the direction of the cabin. Magnus dropped the bucket and ran back, fear like ice in his veins. He burst through the door to find Ophelia crouched by the window, the rifle smoking in her hands. She was white-faced but steady, and Magnus saw one of the strangers lying in the snow outside, not moving. 2 more, Ophelia said. One went around back. The other is in the trees to the left. Magnus grabbed his rifle and positioned himself at the other window. You did good, he said. Now stay down. A shot splintered the door frame and Magnus returned fire, aiming at the muzzle flash in the trees. He heard a cry of pain, then silence. That left one. Come out, mountain man. The voice came from behind the cabin, the scarred leader. Come out or I burn your cabin like I burned your barn. Magnus looked at Ophelia. Her eyes were wide but determined. He made a decision. Keep him talking, he whispered. I am going out the side window. Magnus, no, trust me. He squeezed her hand, then moved to the small window on the north side of the cabin. It was barely big enough to crawl through, but Magnus was nothing if not resourceful. He eased it open, praying the hinges would not squeak, and dropped silently into the snow outside. The night was alive with the roar of the burning barn, throwing wild shadows across the clearing. Magnus used the chaos as cover, circling around behind the cabin with the stealth his father had taught him. He could hear Ophelia shouting something at the man, keeping his attention forward, buying Magnus time. He came up behind the scarred man like a ghost. The outlaw was so focused on the cabin that he never heard Magnus approach. Magnus struck him with the butt of his rifle, a calculated blow that dropped the man like a stone. Ophelia, it is safe. She came running out, still clutching the rifle, and threw herself into Magnus's arms with enough force to stagger him. She was shaking like a leaf, the adrenaline finally catching up with her. It is over, Magnus said, holding her tight. You are safe. It is over. They stood there in the snow, the barn burning behind them, 2 bodies lying in the clearing and a third unconscious at their feet. It was a scene from a nightmare, but they had survived. Together they had survived. When Ophelia finally stopped shaking, Magnus tied up the scarred man and dragged him into the cabin. The other 2 were dead, and there was nothing to be done for them now. The barn was a total loss, but Magnus had managed to free the horses before the whole structure collapsed. They stood in the corral, wild-eyed but unharmed. We will take him to the marshal in the morning, Magnus said, looking at their prisoner. Let the law deal with him. Ophelia nodded, unable to speak. She had taken a life tonight, and Magnus knew that would weigh on her. He pulled her close, guiding her to sit by the fire. "You did what you had to do," he said gently. "He would have killed us both if you had not acted. You have nothing to be ashamed of." "I know," Ophelia whispered, "but knowing and feeling are different things." "Yes, they are." Magnus held her through the rest of the night, keeping watch over both her and their prisoner, giving her what comfort he could. Dawn came gray and cold. Magnus loaded the scarred man onto Ash, tied the bodies to Scout, and prepared for the ride to Concordia. Ophelia insisted on coming with him, and Magnus did not argue. After what she had been through, he did not want to leave her alone. The ride took most of the day. The prisoner was surly and silent, and Magnus was grateful for that. He did not want to hear threats or excuses. He just wanted this business finished so they could get back to their life. Marshal Tate was a lean, weathered man who listened to their story with sharp eyes. He took custody of the prisoner and organized a party to ride out for the bodies. "These men were wanted for robbery and murder down in Missouri," Tate said. "There is a reward for them, dead or alive, probably about $300 total." Magnus had not been thinking about money, but $300 was a small fortune. It would replace the barn and then some. "Send it to my cabin when it comes through," Magnus said. "We will be heading back now." "Before you go," Tate said, "I should mention there has been talk about starting a school here in Concordia. The town is growing, lots of families with children. They are looking for a teacher. Someone educated, someone who can handle the rough edges this place has." He looked at Ophelia. "You interested?" Ophelia glanced at Magnus, and he could see the conflict in her eyes. This was what she had wanted, a chance to teach again. But it would mean leaving the cabin, leaving the mountains. "Leaving him? Can we think about it?" Magnus asked. "Sure, but do not take too long. They are hoping to start after the new year." They found a hotel room for the night, both too exhausted to ride back in the dark. Magnus paid for 2 rooms, but when he walked Ophelia to her door, she caught his hand. "Will you stay?" she asked quietly. "I do not want to be alone tonight." Magnus nodded, following her inside. The room was small and plain, but it had a real bed and clean sheets. They lay down together fully clothed, and Ophelia curled into his side like she belonged there. Magnus wrapped his arms around her, feeling her gradually relax as the night deepened. "Magnus," her voice was soft in the darkness. "Yes, about the teaching position." "You should take it if you want it," Magnus said, even though the words cost him. "I will not hold you to staying in the cabin if you want something different." Ophelia was quiet for a moment. Then she pushed herself up on one elbow to look at him. "What if I do not want something different? What if I want to stay with you?" Magnus's breath caught. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that I have been happier these past months than I have been in years. I am saying that when those men attacked us, my first thought was not for myself but for you. I am saying that somewhere along the way I fell in love with you, Magnus Harlow, and I do not want to leave." Magnus reached up to cup her face, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone. "You mean that, every word. I love you. I think I started loving you the moment you wrapped your coat around me and carried me to the fire. You gave me more than warmth that night. You gave me hope." Magnus pulled her down and kissed her, pouring 8 years of loneliness and longing into that kiss. Ophelia responded with equal fervor, her hands fisting in his shirt, and when they finally broke apart they were both breathing hard. "I love you too," Magnus said roughly. "I have loved you for weeks but was too scared to say it, too scared you would leave like Sarah did." "I am not Sarah," Ophelia said fiercely. "I do not break my promises, and I promise you this: I will never leave you, not for a teaching position, not for anything. You are my home now, Magnus. Wherever you are, that is where I belong." They talked through the night, making plans and promises. In the morning, they went to Marshal Tate and told him Ophelia would not be taking the teaching position. Then they stopped by the general store to buy supplies, and on impulse, Magnus bought a simple gold ring. "Marry me," he said to Ophelia in the middle of the store, not caring who was watching. "Marry me and spend the rest of your life in that cabin with me. I do not have much to offer except my heart and my protection, but they are yours if you want them." "Yes," Ophelia said, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, Magnus, I will marry you." They were wed by a circuit preacher who happened to be passing through, with Marshal Tate and Red Willie standing as witnesses. It was simple and quick, but when Magnus slid that ring onto Ophelia's finger, he felt like the richest man alive. They rode back to the cabin as husband and wife, and if the ride took longer than usual because they kept stopping to kiss, well, there was no one around to complain. Winter deepened, and Magnus and Ophelia settled into their new life together. The reward money came through as promised, and Magnus used it to rebuild the barn bigger and better than before. Ophelia transformed the cabin bit by bit, adding small touches that made it truly theirs: a mirror over the dry sink, wildflowers in a jar during the brief mountain summer, a quilt she pieced together from scraps. Magnus taught her to ski on homemade skis, and they would glide through the winter forest together, laughing when one of them fell. He showed her his secret places: a hot spring hidden in a rocky canyon, a meadow where bighorn sheep came to graze, a waterfall that froze into curtains of ice in winter. Ophelia taught Magnus to read more than just signs and tracks. She had brought books from St. Louis, and in the long winter evenings she would read aloud while he carved or oiled his traps. He discovered he loved poetry, especially when Ophelia read it in her clear, musical voice. She taught him better arithmetic, and his trading improved as a result. But mostly, they taught each other about love. Magnus learned that love was not about grand gestures, but about small daily kindnesses: bringing in extra wood before Ophelia had to ask, warming her side of the bed on cold nights, listening when she needed to talk. Ophelia learned that love was not about perfection, but about acceptance: accepting Magnus's moods, his need for solitude, his scars both visible and invisible. By the time spring came, melting the snow and bringing the mountains back to life, Ophelia was pregnant. Magnus was terrified and thrilled in equal measure. He built a proper cradle from pine wood, smoothing every surface until it was soft as silk. Ophelia sewed tiny clothes and blankets, singing to her belly as she worked. Their son was born in early autumn, a perfect little boy with Magnus's strong features and Ophelia's dark eyes. They named him Michael, and Magnus held him with hands that could break a man's neck, but were infinitely gentle with this tiny life. "He is perfect," Magnus whispered, tears streaming down his weathered face. "He is ours," Ophelia said, looking up at her husband with love shining in her eyes. "The first of many, I hope." Over the next years, 2 more children came: a daughter named Olivia with auburn hair like her mother, and another son they called Matthew. The cabin was expanded to accommodate the growing family, and Magnus built proper bedrooms and a larger kitchen. Life was not always easy. There were harsh winters and failed hunts, sickness and injury. But Magnus and Ophelia faced everything together, their love the foundation on which their family was built. They taught their children to read and write, to track and hunt, to be honest and brave and kind. Magnus never returned to trapping full-time. He found work closer to home, doing occasional guides for hunters or trading with ranchers. He wanted to be present for his children's lives in a way his own father had not been able to be. Ophelia started a small school in their cabin, teaching not just their own children but the few other families that had settled in the area. She never regretted leaving the city behind. Years turned into decades. The children grew up and had families of their own, though they never wandered far from the mountains where they had been raised. Michael became a rancher. Olivia married a veterinarian who set up practice in Concordia, and Matthew followed in his father's footsteps as a guide and hunter. Magnus and Ophelia grew old together, their hair turning gray, their bodies growing slower but their love never diminishing. They would sit on the porch Magnus had built, watching the sun set over the mountains, holding hands like newlyweds. "You ever regret it?" Magnus asked one evening. "Giving up teaching in town, staying up here with me?" Ophelia looked at him with the same fierce love she had shown that night in the hotel room 40 years before. "Not for one single moment. You gave me everything I ever wanted, Magnus Harlow. You gave me love and purpose and a life worth living." "How could I possibly regret that?" Magnus kissed her then, as passionately as his old body would allow. "I love you, Ophelia. I loved you the moment I saw you shivering outside that tavern, and I will love you until my last breath." "And beyond," Ophelia said softly. "Love like ours does not end with death. It is eternal." They lived to see their grandchildren and even a few great-grandchildren. The cabin became a gathering place for the whole family, especially at Christmas when everyone would crowd in, bringing food and laughter and stories. Magnus would sit in his chair by the fire, children at his feet, and tell tales of the old days about the Wild West, about outlaws and mountain lions, about the night he saw a beautiful woman shivering in the cold and decided to bring her inside and give her his fire. And when the children would ask if the story was true, Ophelia would smile and take Magnus's hand. "Every word," she would say. "Your grandfather saved my life that night, and in doing so he gave us all the gift of this family, this love, this life." Magnus passed first in his sleep on a cold winter night, Ophelia curled beside him as she had been for more than 50 years. He died with a smile on his face, surrounded by the evidence of a life well lived, the cabin he had built, the woman he had loved, the family they had created together. Ophelia followed him 6 months later. Their children found her in the bedroom, lying on the bed they had shared, Magnus's old bearskin coat wrapped around her shoulders. On the bedside table was a letter in her careful script. "My darlings," it read, "do not grieve for me. I have lived a beautiful life, full of more love and joy than I ever dreamed possible. When I was young and alone and freezing, a mountain man saw me shivering outside a tavern door. He brought me inside and gave me his fire. But more than that, he gave me himself, his heart, his strength, his unwavering love. He taught me that family is not just blood but choice, that love is not just feeling but action, that home is not a place but a person. I choose to believe that somewhere beyond this life, he is waiting for me. And when I close my eyes for the last time, it will be with the certainty that I am going home to him. Take care of each other. Love fiercely and without reservation. And remember that the greatest gift you can give another person is not shelter or food or wealth, but the warmth of your own fire, freely given. With all my love, Mother." The family gathered in the mountain meadow beside the cabin to lay Magnus and Ophelia to rest side by side. The sun was shining, and the creek sang its eternal song, and everyone agreed that it was exactly as it should be, the mountain man and his bride together forever. Their love a legacy that would endure long after their bodies had returned to the earth. In the years that followed, the cabin became something of a landmark. Travelers would stop to see the place where the great love story had begun, where a mountain man had seen a woman shivering and had made the choice to help her. The story spread, becoming legend, told and retold around campfires and dinner tables across the West. But for those who had known Magnus and Ophelia personally, No story could truly capture what they had shared. It had to be witnessed the way Magnus would touch Ophelia's hand when he passed her in the cabin, as if reassuring himself she was real. The way Ophelia would watch Magnus work, her eyes soft with pride and love. The way they moved together after decades of marriage, two parts of a whole, so attuned to each other that words were often unnecessary. Michael, their eldest, took over the cabin and the land. He ran cattle in the meadow and kept the place exactly as his parents had left it. Visitors were welcome, and Michael would serve them coffee and tell stories about his parents, how they had met, how they had fallen in love, how they had built a life together in these mountains against all odds. "My father always said that love was not something you found," Michael would tell people. "It was something you chose every single day. He chose my mother that night outside the tavern, and he kept choosing her every day for 53 years, and she chose him right back. That is what made them different. Not that they fell in love, but that they stayed in love through everything." On the anniversary of the night Magnus had found Ophelia, the family would gather at the cabin for a celebration. They would light a huge bonfire in the meadow, and as the flames climbed toward the stars, they would raise glasses to toast the couple whose love had created them all. "To Magnus and Ophelia," they would say, "who taught us that sometimes the greatest adventures begin with a simple act of kindness. Who showed us that love is not about finding someone perfect, but about choosing to love someone perfectly. Who proved that a mountain man and a city woman could build something beautiful together if they were willing to work for it." The cabin still stands, a testament to one man's skill and another's determination. The creek still runs clear and cold, and the mountains still rise against the sky, unchanging in a changing world. And sometimes, on winter nights when the wind howls through the pines, locals swear they can see smoke rising from the cabin's chimney and hear the sound of laughter, carried on the breeze, the ghost of a love so strong that not even death could extinguish it. But ghosts or not, the true legacy of Magnus and Ophelia lives on in the descendants who carry their blood and their values, in the grandchildren who learned compassion from Ophelia's stories and strength from Magnus's example, in the great-grandchildren who grew up knowing that they came from love, real and enduring and true. And somewhere in that mountain cabin, if you look carefully, you can still see the mark of their presence. The rocking chair Magnus carved, still solid after all these years. The quilt Ophelia stitched, carefully preserved and brought out on special occasions. The cradle that held 3 generations of babies. The marks on the door frame where Magnus measured the children's heights as they grew. The spot by the hearth where they sat together on countless evenings. The best spot in the house because it was where love lived. The story of the mountain man who saw a woman shivering and brought her inside to give her his fire became more than just a tale. It became a reminder of what one act of kindness could create, how one moment of compassion could ripple forward through time, touching lives that had not yet been born. It became an inspiration to those who heard it, encouraging them to be brave in love, to take chances, to offer their own fire to those who were cold and alone. Magnus and Ophelia never knew how far their story would spread or how many hearts it would touch. They were too busy living it, day by day, choosing each other over and over again. But in living their truth, in loving each other completely and without reservation, they created something immortal, not through fame or fortune, but through the simple, powerful act of building a life together. Their gravestones are simple, 2 matching markers of local stone. Magnus's reads, "He gave her his fire." Ophelia's reads, "She gave him her heart." Together, they tell the whole story of warmth offered and received, of love given and returned, of two souls who found each other on a cold winter night and chose to walk through life hand in hand. And in the end, that is what endures. Not the gold or the land or the possessions, but the love. The choice, made every day to be there for another person, to see them when they are invisible to everyone else, to bring them inside when the world has shut them out, to share your fire, even when your own reserves are low. That is the legacy of Magnus Harlow and Ophelia Jensen, the mountain man and the teacher who built an empire not of wealth but of love. Their fire still burns, passed down through generations, warming all who come within its circle. And as long as there are people who believe in the power of love, who understand that the greatest strength is found in compassion, their story will continue to be told. The mountains stand eternal, witnesses to the love that was born in their shadow. The creek still sings its ancient song. And somewhere in the halls of memory, a mountain man is wrapping his coat around a shivering woman, bringing her inside, giving her his fire. And she is looking up at him with eyes that hold the promise of forever, choosing him as surely as he chose her. That moment, frozen in time, is where their story began. But it had no ending, not really, because love like theirs does not die. It transforms, continuing on in the hearts of those who remember, in the lives of those who were touched by it, in the legacy of kindness and courage that they left behind. It lives in every act of compassion, every choice to help rather than turn away, every heart that opens to love despite the risks. Magnus and Ophelia's children and grandchildren still gather in that mountain cabin, still tell the stories, still feel the presence of the love that built the place. And when they sit by the fire on cold winter nights, they understand what their ancestors knew, that the warmth of human connection is the greatest gift we can give or receive, that seeing another's need and choosing to meet it is the highest calling. That love, real love, is not just a feeling but a decision renewed daily. The Wild West is long gone, replaced by highways and satellites and a world Magnus and Ophelia could never have imagined. But the human need for connection, for love, for someone to bring us inside and share their fire, that need remains eternal. And so does the reminder of their story, teaching us that heroes do not always carry guns or wear badges. Sometimes they just see a person shivering in the cold and decide to help. Sometimes they bring you inside and give you their fire. And sometimes, if you are very lucky, that fire becomes a home, a life, a love story for the ages. And that, in the end, is how a mountain man and a freezing woman became a legend that would outlive them both, proving that the greatest adventures often begin with the simplest of kindnesses, and that love, true love, is the only thing that really matters in this brief and beautiful life we are given.